Alright, today we are going to talk about unwrapping in Maya. And so a lot of people struggle with this concept, and most people will grab something like this, and the modeling tools for the unwrap tools are pretty much right over here. These are the pretty basic tools here. There is the UV editor, which allows you to see how something is automatically unwrapped. And with that idea in mind, you can easily use many of these different tools to kind of do your own methodology and stuff like that. And I'm not going to go over each and every tool in this particular lesson. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go over the concepts behind these tools. And so when you are doing unwrapping, there's a couple different things that you want to think about. First is your UV space. The UV space is this initial square right here. The UVs are the particular objects that are unwrapped here. And a square is automatically like an upside down T, and it works fine for, just basic concepts. But one of the things that you have to understand is that you can unwrap this into several different pieces so that it takes up less of this empty space. That's the first thing that you want to always pay attention to, is how much empty space do you have. Having a lot of empty space basically means that any type of pixel-based imaging that you put on top of it has less pixels to basically create the texture. And so if you're doing something for a video game, what you're ultimately doing is you're creating a waste of pixels that you could be putting in there. So for something like this, we could take this particular object here, and I'm going to just move it off to the side. So we can ultimately take this object and go into, say, this edge here, grab this, and we can shift right click, and we can basically say cut this edge. So by cutting that edge, what that does is now gives you a white border around this. Now I can take this UV shell here and we can rotate it 90 degrees here, and so we can grab that and we can move it down here. Now there still is a lot of empty space to this, but we can grab this now and we can scale it upward to be about this size and move it like this. So this is a better format than, say, the original marking. The next thing that we want to pay attention to is the tiling. So if you click this button here, on here, basically it shows you all the tiling of this. Now, if I'm using this particular object and it is a, say, circle, I'm going to just grab a circle here, we're going to grab that. You'll notice that you have tiling, but it's also stretching. So the issue that you've got going on is you'll have one seam going down the middle here, so you can see the seam that going down the middle. But as you get to the top here, you can see that everything's stretched into long rectangles. Whereas even closer to the equators of this sphere, it's stretched in rectangles going the opposite direction. So this isn't necessarily the best object. What you can try to do is you can grab this whole object here and you can shift right click and say face, select this, and then I can go in here and unfold this. Oops. Right click, unfold, and I'm just going to unfold, and you'll notice what happens is it kind of skews into a different kind of concept. Now, going over the sphere, what's happening is it's overlapping the UV tiling. So what you'll notice here is that the tiling is better. However, this isn't necessarily the best thing either, because as you get closer towards the poles, again, it causes you to have some issues. This is why it's oftentimes better for you to take a square, and I'm just going to take something like this, and I'm just going to, you can see here, it's pretty much wrapped around like so. I'm going to grab this UV shell and I'm going to go into edge, grab that edge, shift right click, and we're just going to cut that. All right, and I'll show you what's going to happen in a second here, but ultimately that, I go back to object mode And then what I can do here is go to mesh and smooth it. I'm going to smooth it in 2 subdivisions. So 1, 2. And you'll notice that it automatically retains more of a spherical aspect. So I can even go further and further and have more kind of points to it. Now you'll notice that while this is a sphere, the tiling is significantly better on something like this. It's not perfectly round, but it at least breaks down the individual components. Now from there, what I could do is I can go to these faces here, and I'm going to shift unfold and unfold that, and you'll notice that it creates a lot more rectangular aspect, but this is a better unwrap than say this right here. So your sphere is almost has a better unwrap than I would have in my regular sphere. So it manages how you do the geometry as well. So if I'm going to something like this, grab this, right click, unfold, and you'll notice I have my 2 pieces here, and I'm just going to rotate it like this. And so this is, if you look at it, is, there we go. So this is a better unwrap than a regular sphere would be, and it is a cleaner and more defined piece of geometry. Now, with this all said and done, basically that's the goal, is to, kind of piece this stuff together. And I'm going to grab these here. These are unwrapped. I don't need to see them, so I'm going to grab them and put them in a new layer, and I'm going to hide them. Now I've got this object here, and it's basically a hard object. It's pretty easy to see, but the difference on this particular object is that it has 2 particular pieces. So it has this piece here, and then this piece as well. So you'll notice where I've extruded these shapes, you'll notice that the UVs are kind of distorted. And that what's happening with that UV is it's already pre-unwrapped as a box, and when I extrude things like this, it is ultimately breaking it apart into smaller pieces. And it's perfectly fine. It's something that we'd have to do and fix down the road. Now, the other aspect is when you're doing a complex object, you don't necessarily have to have the same object as multiple pieces. So you won't have to unwrap this as well as unwrap this. Like, these are all separate pieces. What I can do, however, is select these 2 pieces, and you'll notice when I do, those 2 pieces in particular are kind of put together. Now, what I can do with that is ultimately break them apart. What I can do is I can do UV unwrap here. So this is the automatic unwrapping, and in all reality, this is what I could do. Both of these objects are here, and if I go in and do the automatic unwrapping, what it'll do is it'll project 4 planes. So you can see that there's 4 planes, and it'll kind of break it all apart and give you that kind of best case scenario. All right. Now, what you'll notice here is that they are overlapping because they're 2 pieces. They don't really relate to each other. So what you can do with that is ultimately take one of these pieces like this, and we can simply scale it downward and move it off to the side here. And this piece here, I can overlap this other piece here, so I can just move it over here like so, and I can scale that downward as well. If I don't want the overlap, I can always move it off to the side. And then the piece on the side here, I can grab this piece here, and you'll notice that it's 2 pieces, and you'll notice also that it's a little bit distorted. So with these, I can scale them a little bit more so they're rectangular, so that's closer to what I need. And then I can also move them off to the side, and I can stitch them together. So I'm going to just move them off to the side, and I'm going to grab the edge of this, grab the edge here, and like so, I can stitch these together, And so I can create this like so. So I can stitch these two pieces together, and you'll notice that two pieces right here can be stitched together. I can stitch them together as well and move them in the path here. But there's ultimately, these are things that you have to pay attention to. So with the UV shell, I can easily move this down over here because this one doesn't matter and I don't need to see it. Technically, I can delete the face of geometry, but if I don't have that, I can then grab these two pieces and move them. Let's see here. There's the rotate here. We can rotate it 90 degrees and we can move it off and put it up over here. So I can easily kind of go through and grab this stuff and move it around and grab it like this and even scale it. So you can see here that I've got a lot of empty space. Everything looks good. Now, however, it doesn't necessarily make sense for me. That doesn't mean it's a bad thing. However, if I'm doing this in Photoshop, I probably want to make sure like materials are with like materials. I want to make sure the UVs have some semblance. So if I'm painting something in Photoshop, I have a better understanding of what's going on. If I'm doing it in Substance or another texture software program, it's not as necessary. The big thing is that you use the most amount of space. And if I go in here and look at this, it's not horrible, but there's things that I could easily go in and kind of clean up and play with. So just be aware that that's the mentality that you're looking for. Again, it's about straightness of your UVs. So when I turn on this here, I want to make sure things are squared up. Object is something more organic. So an organic object like this, again, is basically broken into how you want to best unwrap it. Now, with this object in mind, I'm going to grab this, and again, you can still see that it's UV'd up like this. It's not necessarily the best piece, but what I can do is I can grab this, grab my UVs on there, and it's going to break it apart. Now, that's perfectly fine. I'm just going to look at my UVs, and you'll see that there's a little bit of stretching around where it's rounded, especially around the ends here and stuff like that. So there are things that I can do to kind of piece this stuff together. Now, does this have to be all like perfect? No. The big thing is getting it as close as possible and basically understanding where the kind of wraps and stuff like that go. So in this case, I can grab something like this. I can go in and unfold it, and you'll notice that it really doesn't change that much. However, if I grab something like this side piece and I unfold it, again, not that big deal. I have certain spots. So like looking here, I'm going to grab this, and we're just going to, again, move and sew. I'm going to grab this piece here, and I'm going to move and sew, and I'm going to just grab this final piece here. And move and sew. So these pieces are basically kind of unified together. I'm going to go to my shell, grab my shell, and I'm going to move it off in space so that you can ultimately see kind of what's going on. Now, is this the best way to do it? Not necessarily. I have to go in and clean up some little pieces here like this. I can stitch these together and so on and so forth. But when I do a UV, when I go back to my face mode and grab all this and unfold it, you'll notice that it now angles a little bit more, and it's going to give you a much better kind of polygonal face. Now, does it need to have, you'll see that it's angled here. Does it need to have it straight? No, it does not. The big thing I want to pay attention to is ultimately one thing. Like, one is where the seams are. So you'll notice I have one seam here, and if I can hide it, maybe I'd put it over here instead. I can move that seam over here, basically reiterating and changing that process. My biggest goal in something like this is basically putting things together that make the most amount of sense. So even something like this, so I'm going into this edge mode here, and we're just going to grab that and to move and sew, and then we're going to grab that, and we're going to move and sew that. And so here you'll notice that this is more completed piece. I can still go in and kind of play around with some of these edges a little bit more, but ultimately, like, my goal is to basically put things together so that it makes more sense of like where things are going. And so you can see here, I'm going to move this. Let's just rotate it off here. I'm going to move that up over like so eventually. And then these spare pieces that are floating around, I can go in the edges and see where they lie, and potentially like change those edges. So you'll notice that I have some weird things going on there, and I can ultimately stitch that together with something else. So it's basically just a matter of going through and figuring out how to best organize this content. But my end goal is to basically put all these pieces back in so that they are relaxed enough that I get a good square content, and ultimately I can apply a texture without the texture distorting. And that's why the rectangles aren't good in a sphere, but they're much better in a square that's basically added more of a smoothing to it, so adding more geometry. So with that idea in mind, I hope that helps your cause, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask.